Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Miss Marple and the Vanishing Train Passenger, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Miss Marple. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Man Who Never Stepped Off the Train. A passenger vanished between stations, and none of the doors were ever opened. The rain had begun in a slow, steady patter as the 516 from Paddington pulled into Milchester Holt, little more than a raised platform, a faded sign, and a gas lamp flickering like a nervous eye in the encroaching dusk. The porter, a stooped figure with a limp and a fondness for pipe tobacco, waited with the disinterest born of years in the same uniform. But tonight, something gave him pause. There was supposed to be a gentleman in first class alighting here, ticket checked, seat reserved, luggage labelled, and sent ahead to the Old Swan Inn. But when the train groaned to a stop, the compartment was empty. Not empty as in he'd stepped off quickly. Empty as in not a soul had been in it since London. No one had opened the door. By the time Miss Marple arrived at the inn, summoned not by mystery, but by mild bronchitis and a recommendation from Dr. Haydock to take the country air, the matter was already the subject of quiet, intense speculation. Her room overlooked the small village green, now slick with rain and dotted with umbrellas. She could just make out the smoke, curling from the station chimney and the muddy prints that stopped abruptly on the gravel path. Miss Marple had always believed that truth had a way of pressing itself forward, however quietly it began. And something about the case of the man who never stepped off the train stirred an old and curious place in her mind. The man in question was Mr. Simon Worsley, a solicitor from Bloomsbury, 48 years of age, bachelor, punctual, and, according to the innkeeper, Mrs. Withers, a thoroughly decent sort who wrote ahead and requested a boiled egg for supper. He had booked a week's stay, asked for room number 3, and paid a deposit by cheque. The cheque had cleared. His luggage, a battered leather valise, and an umbrella had arrived hours earlier. And then, nothing. The room stood untouched, the supper cold, the egg soft and wasted. Miss Marple, who found herself invariably interested in other people's peculiarities, listened as Mrs. Withers relayed these details with theatrical whispers over a teapot. "Vanished," she said, eyes wide. "And the porter swears no one left the carriage. Door was locked from the inside when it arrived. Yet he was seen boarding at Paddington, plain as day." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "I wonder," she said thoughtfully, "whether anyone saw him between Paddington and Milchester." "Well, that's just it, isn't it?" Mrs. Withers leaned in. "Ticket collector says he punched Mr. Worsley's ticket after Maidenhead. That was the last anyone saw of him. And here's the chill of it. When they opened the compartment door, still locked, mind you, the seat cushion was damp." "Damp?" Miss Marple asked quietly, as if someone had spilled a glass of water. Or, here she lowered her voice, though they were quite alone. "Blood." Miss Marple blinked, and no sign of either. "Not a drop, just the faintest discoloration and a smell like, I don't know, iron maybe." That night Miss Marple's sleep was restless, a pattern of dreams made of steam and lurching carriages and footsteps that never quite reached their destination. By morning, she was resolved. It had rained again overnight, harder this time, washing away footprints and muting the landscape. She visited the station, umbrella in hand, speaking to the porter, a man named Griggs. Griggs was reticent at first. Old men in stations tended to be, but Miss Marple's kindly gaze and innocent questions had a way of coaxing truth from even the most sullen sorts. "No, ma'am," he said finally. "No one got off. That door stayed shut the whole way. I saw the handle hadn't been turned. And I were waiting for him, you see." Room was ready. In sent young Harold down with the case. He scratched his chin. "You don't just disappear like that. Not unless you're meant to." "Meant to?" she prompted. "Meaning," he muttered, "someone didn't want him getting here." The train carriage itself, she was told, had been moved to the siding and locked up. Standard procedure, they said. But Miss Marple had never trusted procedure more than she trusted her own instincts. She persuaded the constable, a young man who considered her more of a gentle nuisance than a threat to order, to let her have a look inside. The compartment was plain, upholstered in a moss-green tweed that had faded with time, the scent of dust and old leather heavy in the air. The cushion where Worsley had sat bore only the faintest mark, like a damp shadow that had nearly dried. Miss Marple ran a gloved hand gently over it, her fingers catching ever so slightly on the fabric's nap. She said nothing. It was the window that made her pause. Not broken, not even open, but the latch. Ah, yes. The latch had been freshly oiled, unlike the one on the opposite side, which squeaked loudly when jostled. "Curious," she murmured. "What is, ma'am?" asked Constable Fenn. "Only that someone prepared this window to move silently, but not the other." The window opened outward slightly, hinged from the top, a small ventilation pane, more than a full exit. A grown man could not have escaped through it, but a package, a letter, a tool, or a hand. Her eyes lingered on the edge of the sill, where the condensation had gathered in a faint line. There, almost invisible, was a smudge, long and thin, as if something narrow had slid against it in haste. When she returned to the inn, a letter awaited her. It was not addressed to her directly, but left at the front desk by a boy with no name, for the guest in number 7. The envelope was thick and cream-colored, the writing angular and rushed. Inside, a single sheet. He was never meant to arrive. Don't trust the one who cries too soon. Miss Marple reread the note several times. The handwriting, while shaky, had a curious tilt. Left-handed, most likely. Not the penmanship of a child, a rushed adult, someone afraid. She thought back to what she had heard already. Mr. Worsley had no family in Milchester, no friends, as far as anyone knew, no business connections to the village. And yet, he had asked for a particular room. Number 3. She asked Mrs. Withers, who looked momentarily flustered. "Well, yes," the landlady admitted. "He requested it, directly. I asked if he'd stayed before, but he said no. Just that he'd heard it was quiet." "But is it quiet?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Withers hesitated. "Some say it's unlucky. We had a guest last year, Mr. Tilney. Very kind man. Retired naval officer. Died in his sleep, poor thing." Miss Marple nodded. "That's sad. Did he have visitors?" "Just a niece, I believe. Came down from Oxford to settle his affairs." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "And did she cry too soon?" Mrs. Withers frowned. "She was very upset. But yes, I suppose she did wail a bit before the doctor even confirmed he'd passed." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes distant. That evening she wrote a letter to her nephew Raymond and asked him to look up any public records on Simon Worsley and one Eleanor Tilney. It might mean nothing, but Miss Marple had always found that women who cried too soon often had something to hide, or something they feared others might discover first. The following morning brought new unease. Gardner from the estate bordering the railway sidings reported finding a pair of torn gloves half buried near the fence. Leather, men's, one finger slit at the seam. The gardener had thought little of them until the village talk reached his ears. Miss Marple was permitted to examine the gloves. She noted the wear on the thumbs, the scuff at the palms, habitual use, but the slit in the finger was precise, not torn, cut deliberately, to slip something through perhaps, a ring, a key. Later, as the wind stirred the hedges and brought with it the scent of impending rain, Miss Marple sat on the bench outside the station, her gaze settled not on the tracks, but on the distant manor house perched at the edge of the woods. Tilney House, the same place where a man had died quietly in room 3, and where a niece had cried too soon. A house with a locked study, an inherited estate, and, if her instincts were correct, a connection to the man who had never stepped off the train. She did not yet know how Simon Worsley was tied to that place, but she suspected he had not come for the air or the boiled egg. He had come to confront something, or someone. The truth pressed against her thoughts like a shadow behind a curtain. There was a reason Worsley had vanished, and someone in Milchester knew what it was. When the next train pulled in, a figure disembarked, a woman smartly dressed in a navy coat, her gloves pristine. She asked for directions to Tilney House, and Miss Marple, who never trusted coincidences, watched her go with narrowed eyes. By nightfall, there was another note, slipped under her door. Room 3 is for the ones who know too much. Miss Marple read it once, then turned it over. The paper bore a faint watermark, Tilney House Stationery. Her heart beat a little faster, but her hands were steady. She rose, set the letter aside, and rang for hot water. She would visit the manor tomorrow, but tonight she would sit with her thoughts and her knitting, and recall every story she'd ever heard of people who vanished from trains, only to turn up in memories someone else wanted buried. The man who never stepped off the train had indeed arrived in Milchester, just not in the way he'd intended, and someone, somewhere, was counting on no one noticing the difference. Chapter 2. The Widow Who Knew His Name. She claimed to be his wife, but the local records said he never existed. It was the rain again, that persistent, whispering drizzle that seemed to soak into the bones of Milchester village and refuse to leave. It turned the cobbles slick, muffled the sound of footsteps, and gave every face in the street the blurred, watercolor softness of a half-remembered dream. Miss Marple stood at the parlor window of the old Swan Inn, watching a woman step out of the taxi with a black veil over her face and a carpet bag clutched to her chest. The driver hauled a small trunk after her, marked with a faded London label. She moved with that particular stiffness of grief, too composed, too conscious of being watched. Mrs. Withers came bustling in with the tea tray, nearly spilling the milk. "Arrived just now," she said, voice a mixture of awe and suspicion. "Claims to be Mr. Worsley's widow." Miss Marple blinked mildly. Widow, but no one even knew he was married. Nor that he vanished, apparently, Mrs. Withers sniffed. But she says they were married last spring. Common law, perhaps. You know how the city folk are. Miss Marple did not comment on the city folk. She continued to watch the woman with the veil as she was led to room 3. That was the curious part. She had asked for it, specifically. Not the most comfortable, nor the largest, but the same one Simon Worsley had reserved, the same room where, last year, a naval officer had died, quietly, in his sleep. By mid-afternoon, the whole village had hummed with speculation. The grocer claimed he'd seen her at the station a week prior, waiting without boarding a train. The postmistress said the name Mrs. Worsley meant nothing. No marriage certificate, no letters forwarded, no entry in the parish rolls. That evening, Miss Marple happened to cross paths with the woman in the drawing room. The inn was quiet, save for the clock and the ticking rain. The woman sat by the fireplace, her veil lifted to reveal a narrow, composed face with eyes that did not look quite as sad as a widow's should. Miss Marple greeted her gently. "Forgive me, but I believe we are fellow guests. Jane Marple." The woman hesitated, then offered a hand. "Alice Worsley. I'm sorry, I'm not much for conversation these days." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said kindly. "Grief is a peculiar companion. It rarely keeps the same hours twice." Alice Worsley gave a faint smile. Yes, it has its own timetable. There was something behind her words, not just sorrow, control. She was watching Miss Marple's face as much as Miss Marple was watching hers. "Did you know your husband had never stayed here before?" Miss Marple asked conversationally. "I did," Alice replied, "but he used to speak of it. He passed through Milchester once on business, always meant to return." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet, the local register has no record of your marriage." Alice's eyes narrowed, just slightly. "We were married in France, Aix-en-Provence. He had business there last spring. I was teaching English. It was impromptu." "How romantic," Miss Marple said gently. "Though I imagine it makes things complicated now." Alice looked down at her gloves. "Everything is complicated now." Miss Marple offered no judgment, but something in her stirred. The kind of instinct born from church bake sales, troubled nieces, and quiet afternoons reading the agony columns. The next morning, she walked into the village and made inquiries: the grocer, the postmistress, the railway clerk. None had seen Alice Worsley before last week. None had heard of a Mrs. Worsley writing ahead or making arrangements. Yet she had claimed to have been summoned when Simon went missing. She returned to the inn to find Alice in the hall, speaking quietly with a man Miss Marple did not recognize. Late 30s, neat moustache, city-cut coat. They stopped when they saw her. "Oh," Alice said quickly, "Miss Marple, this is an old friend, Edmund Lee." Mr. Lee gave a polite nod. "Pleasure." Miss Marple, who rarely missed a flicker in a person's tone, offered a thin smile. "Indeed, I do hope you're helping Mrs. Worsley manage her affairs. Death is a bureaucratic nuisance, I find." Alice stiffened. "He's assisting with some papers." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. Later, in the reading room, Miss Marple happened to glance at the guest registry. Edmund Lee had not signed in. She asked Mrs. Withers, who frowned. Said he wasn't staying, just visiting. No law against that. No law, but a certain avoidance of formality and an unwillingness to be recorded. Miss Marple made a note to mention it in her next letter to her nephew Raymond. London men like Mr. Lee often left behind trails, even if they tried to walk lightly. That evening, the widow came down late to supper, eyes red and voice tremulous. She claimed to have received word. Simon Worsley's body had been found, somewhere along the line between Maidenhead and Milchester, A witness had come forward, a farmer who thought he'd seen a coat caught on a branch in the hedgerow. The police were investigating. She would go to identify him tomorrow. The news swept through the inn like wildfire, but Miss Marple found it curious that no constable had come to speak of it first. Only Alice Worsley, and only after her mysterious friend had departed. Miss Marple had begun to form a theory, not a certainty, never that, but the delicate scaffolding of an idea. She needed more. She walked to the station again the next morning, ignoring the drizzle. Griggs, the porter, was sweeping leaves from the platform. "Terrible news," she said, "about the body." Griggs nodded solemnly. "If true, it's a cruel end. Though I wonder how he'd have ended up in the hedges with the carriage locked tight." "So do I," said Miss Marple. "And tell me, Griggs, has anyone been by to check the siding carriage?" "No, ma'am. Still locked up. Not a soul touched it since." "May I have another look?" He hesitated. "You've a way of asking that makes me feel I'd be a fool to say no." She smiled. Back in the carriage, she inspected the seat again. The stain had faded even more, but the scent remained, metallic and cold. She reached beneath the bench, fingers groping in the dark, and touched something hard. She drew it out, a broken cufflink, gold, with the initials SW engraved delicately in an oval crest, but not in the modern style. Older, Edwardian perhaps, an heirloom. The clasp had snapped, and the link had been crushed. She brought it to the constable that afternoon, asking him to confirm whether Mr. Worsley's widow had mentioned the item missing. Constable Fenn said she hadn't. In fact, she'd provided almost no details about his belongings at all, only insisted she be notified immediately if the body was found. By the time Alice returned from her supposed journey to the hedgerows, she looked pale and shaken. "It was him," she whispered. They found his signet ring." Miss Marple leaned forward, voice very soft. "But not the body?" Alice paused. "Number." "But the farmer said he saw it. A man in a dark suit, face down, gone by morning. But the ring was on the fence post. It must have snagged when he fell." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Curious that he would fall in such a way as to leave behind only jewelry." Alice's lips pressed into a thin line. "Perhaps animals disturbed the rest." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. That evening, as thunder rolled distantly through the hills, Miss Marple wrote another letter to Raymond. This time, she requested information on Alice Worsley. Nay, whatever name she had before. She included a description and asked pointedly whether there were records of a Simon Worsley's marriage anywhere, France or otherwise. Rain lashed the windows that night. At midnight, a sound woke her. Footsteps, faint, down the hallway. A door creaked. She rose silently, wrapped her shawl, and opened her door a crack. Alice Worsley was descending the stairs, in slippers, a shawl over her head. She moved with care, like someone used to slipping through houses unseen. Miss Marple followed. Alice moved toward room 3. She opened it, key in hand. Not the one Mrs. Withers gave her, a duplicate. She slipped inside. 10 minutes passed. Then she emerged again, carrying something in a small wrapped cloth. Miss Marple stepped forward. "You've grown fond of that room." Alice froze. Her face, caught in the moonlight from the stairwell window, looked ghostly. Then it hardened. "I needed a moment." "Grief does strange things," Miss Marple said softly, "but theft is more methodical." Alice said nothing. "You've been here before," Miss Marple continued, "not as a wife, as something else. Perhaps a niece. To a Mr. Tilney. Alice's mouth parted. Her fingers clenched the cloth. You cried before the doctor arrived, Miss Marple said, and now you return, claiming a husband whose name appears nowhere except on a pair of broken cufflinks hidden beneath a bench. He came here to meet someone, Mrs. Worsley, but not to stay. He was coming to confront, or retrieve, or expose. Alice's voice shook. You don't know anything. On the contrary, Miss Marple said, I know when a woman chooses grief as a costume, and I know a performance when I see it. Alice turned, footsteps sharp, and disappeared down the corridor. Miss Marple did not follow. In the morning, Constable Fenn arrived with news. Simon Worsley's marriage, records did not exist, but Alice Worsley had once been Eleanor Tilney, niece of the man who died in room 3 last year. Miss Marple listened quietly. And the ring? She asked. Engraved, he said, but not with SW. It's older, family crest, not Simon's. Miss Marple's eyes darkened. She went to room 3 once more. On the dresser, half concealed beneath a folded towel, was a newspaper clipping. She lifted it. A legal notice. Probate of the late Charles Tilney contested. Alleged irregularity in the will. Potential claimant, Simon Worsley of Bloomsbury. Miss Marple folded it carefully. She had found the motive, but not the killer, and as the thunder rolled in again, she knew. Chapter 3. The ticket. That wasn't punched. His seat was warm, his coat still hanging, but the conductor swears he was never there. It was a gust of wind that first called attention to the abandoned coat. A porter, closing up the last carriage of the late evening train from Paddington to Milchester, found it hanging neatly on the peg above seat 3A in first class. Tweed, well-brushed, unmistakably expensive. Still faintly warm. A half-folded newspaper rested on the seat cushion, the corner lifted by the draft. Beneath it, a train ticket tucked just beside the armrest, unsullied by any punch mark. But what turned the porter's stomach, what made him hurry at once for the station master, was the faint impression left in the seat, the curve of a man's weight, recently risen. The sort of warmth that doesn't linger long, unless the body that left it had been there minutes before. Miss Marple heard the story from Constable Fenn the next morning, over a cup of tea in the reading room of the old Swan Inn. It was told in a hushed voice, half admonishing himself for giving it to her. But he had begun to learn that Miss Marple, in her quiet way, absorbed truths others skipped past. No one saw him board, Fenn said, and no one saw him leave. Conductor insists he never punched a ticket from seat 3A. Says he checks them all like clockwork. Does the conductor remember if that particular seat was empty when he passed? Miss Marple asked gently, peering into her teacup as if divining answers in the dregs. Claims it was unoccupied, though, Fenn added, glancing sideways, these things blur on long runs, especially in the rain. The rain had indeed returned, thickening the air with that persistent English melancholy that seems always on the edge of memory. Outside, the sky lay heavy over Milchester. Inside, a storm of another kind gathered. Unspoken questions, folded letters, and curious absences. Has anyone identified the coat? Miss Marple asked. Fenn hesitated. That's the odd thing. It bears a tailor's label, Blake and Smythe, Bloomsbury. The same tailor Simon Worsley used, according to his solicitor. The lining even has a faint monogram, SW. Miss Marple didn't blink. And yet his widow never mentioned it missing. Number. In fact, she's claimed she packed all his clothing before their supposed trip to Aix. All accounted for. How very orderly, Miss Marple murmured. Tell me, what of the newspaper? Yesterday's Times, folded to the finance section. A crossword partly, filled in. Pen found with it. No fingerprints. Miss Marple allowed herself a soft sigh. Because you didn't look for them. Fen flushed. Well, we've not the kit for that. I understand, she said, but you have eyes, and eyes often suffice. After he left, she sat a moment longer in the hush of the reading room. The ticking clock sounding suddenly like a heartbeat. She could picture it clearly. The seat still warm, the coat swinging gently, the paper fluttering like a breath, and the unpunched ticket a silent witness. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way, once again, to the Milchester station. The platform was slick with rain, and the waiting room smelled of damp wool and boiled tea. She found Griggs, the porter who had discovered the scene, drying his cap near the stove. "Miss Marple," he said, straightening. "Back again?" "I find trains rather revealing," she said mildly. "They carry people with secrets in both directions." He chuckled, then lowered his voice. "Truth be told, I don't like what I saw. Felt like he'd just stepped out. I called and called. Nobody answered." "Did the seat feel warm to the touch?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." As if he'd been there just a minute before, like he'd popped to the lavatory and meant to come back. "But no one ever did." "No, ma'am. And the guard said no one boarded at Reading either, and all doors were locked after departure from there." Miss Marple glanced at the station master's office. "May I see the carriage?" he agreed, unlocking the door to the siding where the train car had been placed. It sat quiet, hulking like a sleeping beast in the grey drizzle. Inside, the carriage still smelled faintly of tobacco and damp wool. Miss Marple approached seat 3A. The coat still hung there. She studied it, noting the cuffs, the wear on the inside lining, a faint snag in the collar. Then, with gloved fingers, she checked the pockets. The left held a train timetable. The right held a matchbook. She turned it over. It was from the Green Raven Club in London, a quiet but notorious little establishment not known for its hospitality to married men with tidy lives. Miss Marple tucked it into her handbag. The newspaper still rested on the seat. She inspected the crossword. Several words were filled in, competently, neatly, in blue ink. She made a mental note of the completed clues, and one in particular, hollow deception in 4 letters. The answer scrawled in capitals, lie. She moved to the window and saw something curious. The condensation on the glass showed a faint outline of a hand, left, based on the smudges. Not recent, but enough to indicate someone had leaned there. Yet the conductor swore no one had sat here, and no witness reported seeing anyone leave, unless someone else had entered before the train departed. Someone who knew Simon Worsley, or his tailor. She returned to the inn just as the supper bell rang. Mrs. Withers was fluttering about the lobby, clutching her guest book and frowning. "Something wrong?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Another visitor," the innkeeper said. "Asked for Mrs. Worsley, gave no name, left a note. When I asked to see his ID, he vanished before I could say, 'Crumpet.'" Miss Marple took the note. A plain envelope, no return address. Inside, a single phrase typed on stiff card. "You're not the only one who knows what room 3 cost him." Miss Marple read it twice. A game was being played. Not of grief, but of leverage. That night, she lay awake, turning over the elements. The warm seat, the punch ticket that wasn't, the coat with a hidden history, a man who should have stepped off the train, but didn't, and a widow whose tears were stitched more from habit than heartbreak. Morning brought clarity, or perhaps just resolve. She asked Constable Fenn to obtain the passenger manifest for the train in question. Every name, every ticket sold, and most importantly, a list of who had claimed to sit in first class. He returned, mid-afternoon, with a folder, damp at the corners. Inside, rows of neatly typed names. But one thing stood out. There was no record of a ticket sold for seat 3A. Miss Marple's voice was low. So, the man who left behind his coat and his warmth was never supposed to be there. Fenn looked confused. But he was there. Someone was. Precisely, she said. And that someone knew no one would be checking his ticket, or hers. Fenn's brow furrowed. You think someone planted it? I think someone impersonated Simon Worsley, sat in that seat, made a show of being him, long enough to be remembered by no one, and then slipped away. But to what end? Miss Marple gave him a cool, thoughtful look. To ensure Simon Worsley never made it to Milchester at all. But the body— There is no body, she said sharply, only rumours and rings placed on fence posts, and now a ghost in a train seat. A soft knock at the reading room door interrupted them. Mrs. Withers stepped in. Miss Marple, Mrs. Worsley has disappeared. Miss Marple did not rise at once. Did she leave a note? Number just packed in a hurry and slipped away this morning. Harold says he saw a car pick her up just past the green. And her bill? Settled in full. Miss Marple finally stood. She knew she was running out of time. Fenn rubbed his jaw. Think she did it? Miss Marple didn't answer. She walked upstairs and opened the door to room 3. The scent was different now, less of lavender, more of unease. On the windowsill, a letter. Miss Marple unfolded it. It wasn't meant to go this far. I only wanted what was owed to me. But he wouldn't stop. He kept asking, and I had to silence him. Find the ticket. Miss Marple read the final line twice. Find the ticket. She returned to the carriage one last time that evening, as the fog rolled down from the hills. Fenn accompanied her. They pried up the seat cushion, careful now, searching not for warmth, but something heavier. It was tucked into the seam, beneath the springs. A second ticket. Not for Simon Worsley, for Eleanor Tilney. Miss Marple stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at Fenn. She boarded that train as him, slipped into his coat, hid her ticket, sat for just long enough to leave behind the illusion. And then? Then, Miss Marple said, she vanished between stations. Like he did. The storm was coming again. But it no longer mattered. They had found the one thing that didn't lie. And someone was about to answer for the seat that still held a ghost. Chapter 4. The woman in compartment 6. She saw everything. And now she's disappeared without a trace. It was the shrill whistle of the mail train that woke Miss Marple at just past 4 in the morning. The sound came with the usual mournful echo down the valley, slipping between hedgerows and stone fences like a secret past in the dark. But this morning, there was something else. A faint, irregular knock at the inn's back entrance. By the time Miss Marple wrapped her shawl and stepped softly into the hallway, she heard the heavy thump of hurried boots fading into the rain. When she opened the door, she found nothing but a piece of paper pinned to the wood with a sewing needle. She tugged it free and turned it beneath the flickering gaslight. She saw what happened in the corridor between 5 and 6. You'll find her before they do, if you're quick. No signature. The paper was torn from a railway timetable, folded, damp, but unmistakable in urgency. Miss Marple stood still for a long moment, her mind turning with quiet precision. There had been a woman in compartment 6. Of that, she was certain. The conductor, interviewed after the discovery of the abandoned coat and the seat still warm in First Class 3A, had briefly mentioned a nervous-looking passenger who boarded at Reading and kept to herself. "I only saw her the once," he'd said. Veil over her face, gloved hands, a travelling cloak like something out of a Bronte novel. Seemed frightened, if you ask me. Jumped when I knocked. She hadn't been listed on the passenger manifest, not formally anyway, but she had existed, and now she, too, had vanished. Before breakfast, Miss Marple was at the station. Rain misted the platform in a low, drifting veil, and the porter, Griggs, looked startled to see her again. "I wonder," she asked calmly, "if I might trouble you to describe the woman who sat in compartment 6 on the 5:16 from Paddington 3 nights ago." Griggs blinked. "Well now, let me think. She was short, no taller than you, I'd wager. Pale gloves, white at the knuckles, blue hat. I noticed because the veil was pinned to it. Old-fashioned. Sat close to the window, didn't speak a word. Did she board with luggage?" "No, ma'am, just a handbag. The sort with a brass clasp. Couldn't say what was inside." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And no one saw her leave?" That's just the thing. She weren't in the carriage when it arrived, but the cushions still held the shape of her. Back at the inn, she pored over the manifest again. Still no name for compartment 6, but Constable Fenn, summoned reluctantly by Miss Marple's insistence, turned up with new information. "There's something odd," he said. "We got a letter posted from Basingstoke. No return address. Inside was a torn train ticket stub. Seat 6B, first class. It matches the same journey as Worsley's." Miss Marple took the stub carefully. "Punched?" "No," Fenn said grimly. "Untouched." She studied it. The ink had bled slightly, from damp, but the stamp was clear. 5:16. Paddington to Milchester. The compartment was confirmed, but the woman was still a ghost. "She didn't want to be seen," Miss Marple said, "or found." That afternoon she walked into the village, past the drapers, where the latest bolts of tweed hung limp in the window, past the green, where the grass remained slick from last night's storm. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Selwyn, spotted her and invited her in for tea, as she often did when her nerves had begun to chatter. "Have you heard," she asked breathlessly, "about the woman? Disappeared from the train?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Selwyn whispered. "My cousin Ethel's boy, Teddy, works the early shift at the junction past Newbury. Said they found a handbag just lying on the side of the track. Nothing inside but a locket." Miss Marple set down her cup. "A locket? With a photograph? Old. Faded," he said, "but it looked like a naval officer in uniform. Name inscribed inside, to M. Always yours. C." A memory stirred. Miss Marple remembered the obituary tucked between the ledgers in the Milchester Church archive. Charles Tilney, retired naval captain, deceased last spring. A name that had appeared more than once around room 3, and now a locket with initials that matched. That evening, after writing a short note to Raymond requesting information on known associates of Charles Tilney, Miss Marple requested to revisit the train car one final time before it was returned to service. With Fenn's reluctant permission, she made her way down the sidings with a lantern and gloves. She stepped into compartment 6. The cushions were dry now. The carriage cleaner had done his duty. But Miss Marple reached beneath the seat cushion and found a loose thread, navy blue, the color of a traveling cloak. She slipped it into her reticule. Then her fingers brushed something else, a hairpin. silver. Not the kind worn loosely, the kind designed to hold a veil in place. She stood and turned to the door. It was closed, but unlocked. She stepped into the corridor, her thoughts moving as precisely as stitches on a hem. What had the woman seen? The train had passed through Reading. Somewhere between compartments 5 and 6, something had happened. Something that caused Simon Worsley to vanish and Eleanor Tilney to impersonate a dead man. Perhaps the woman in compartment 6 had seen Worsley bored, unaware he'd become a target. Perhaps she'd heard the argument, the struggle, or even witnessed someone leaving Worsley's compartment wearing his coat. Miss Marple returned to the inn just as dusk began to settle over the village. Fen was waiting for her. "We traced the locket," he said. "Belonged to Margaret Holloway. Used to work as a housemaid at Tilney House years ago. Left under unclear circumstances." "Scandal?" Miss Marple asked. "Likely. A child, perhaps, or a romance gone sour. Nothing in writing." "And where is she now?" "Gone," he said. "Hasn't been seen since the night of the storm. But her landlady said she left a note behind. Just 2 words." Miss Marple stared. Too late. She closed her eyes. The locket, the initials, the ghost in compartment 6. She had returned to Milchester not for nostalgia, but to confront something long buried. And now, she too had vanished. Before retiring that night, Miss Marple asked Mrs. Withers for access to the guest ledger from the spring of last year. The month Captain Tilney died in room 3. She found it. A short entry, M. Holloway, 2 nights, no forwarding address. Right below it, a smudged mark where someone had clearly tried to erase a second name. She turned to Mrs. Withers. "Who handled check-in that week?" "Harold," the landlady said, though he was quite new then. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I believe it's time I had a talk with Harold." He was reluctant at first, but Miss Marple had a way of coaxing truth from even the tightest lips. "I remember her," he said finally. "The Holloway woman. She came in shaking, paid cash, no bags, just the cloak and a letter in her hand." "A letter?" "Addressed to the late Mr. Tilney. I remember the handwriting, all curls and slant." "Did she meet with him?" He shook his head. "Number she asked to leave the letter in room 3. I let her. She came back out white as a ghost. And then? She left. Never came back." Miss Marple exhaled slowly. Somewhere, someone had opened that letter. Someone who now had reason to keep Margaret Holloway quiet. By morning, a telegram arrived from Raymond. One line stood out. "Eleanor Tilney withdrew large funds from Charles Tilney's estate 2 weeks before Worsley's disappearance. Claimed to be settling an old debt to a woman named Holloway." Miss Marple stared at the message. Margaret had come to collect. Eleanor had pretended to oblige. And then Simon Worsley arrived, perhaps with evidence of the true inheritance. Too many people had too much to lose. Miss Marple set her teacup down, carefully. Somewhere, Margaret Holloway had fled with the truth, or died for it, and only the missing letter could tell her which. She rose, pulled on her gloves, and walked once more to Tilney House. The rain began again, just as she reached the gate. She knew now what she was looking for, and whoever had hidden it was beginning to understand. Miss Marple was not a woman to miss a thread once it had been sewn. Chapter 5. The suitcase that changed hands. Someone took the wrong bag, or the right one, with something to hide. The storm rolled in, just after tea, not a sharp crack of thunder, but a slow, rolling weight that pressed against the windows of the old Swan Inn and filled the rooms with the scent of soaked hedgerows and coal smoke. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner of the reading room, her knitting untouched in her lap, eyes half closed, in that particular way she often assumed when she was thinking very, very carefully. She had just received a visit from Constable Fenn, whose round face was flushed from the wet and whose boots left small puddles on the carpet as he paced awkwardly before her. "There's been a mix-up," he had said, and it had taken some coaxing before the rest came out. A suitcase had been left behind at Milchester Station, unclaimed, anonymous, locked. It had been found that morning by the station cleaner in the corner of the lost property room, which was odd in itself, since no one recalled placing it there. Even Griggs, usually attentive to every item on the platform, swore he had not seen it the day before. But what made the matter curious, and thus inevitably something Miss Marple was summoned to hear, was this. The suitcase bore a faded luggage tag marked S.W., the same initials as the late, vanished Mr. Simon Worsley. And yet, it contained not solicitor's ledgers or pressed shirts, but a silk scarf smelling faintly of jasmine, a crushed theatre program from Paris, and a silver cigarette case engraved with the initials E.T. Eleanor Tilney, Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to the constable. She looked up. "And you're quite certain it was locked when found?" "Absolutely. But the lock was fragile. Cheap sort. The inspector gave permission to open it. Thought it might be connected to the other events." "Oh, it is," Miss Marple said gently, though not in the way anyone expects. Now she sat quietly, thoughts gathering like the storm. Outside, a suitcase, a theatre program, a case that belonged not to a man, but a woman. Someone had exchanged bags, intentionally or not, and that mistake, Miss Marple suspected, had revealed far more than they intended. She requested to see the suitcase herself. Fenn obliged, though not without grumbling. It was housed for the time being in the vicar's shed, of all places, beneath a blanket and beside a dusty bicycle. Miss Marple lifted the lid and examined the contents slowly, methodically. The scarf was silk, expensive, but with a small tear at one corner, as if it had caught on a nail. The perfume was unmistakably French. The theatre program was dated 6 months prior from a production at the Théâtre Montparnasse, and tucked inside was a torn ticket stub and the press stem of a rose, browned and brittle with age. She opened the cigarette case carefully. The initials were finely etched. On the inner lid was a small inscription, almost invisible against the silver. "For the nights you made me forget the world. S." Miss Marple closed it softly. Simon Worsley. She returned to the inn and asked for Mrs. Withers, who bustled in with her usual air of brisk efficiency. "Did Mr. Worsley's luggage arrive before he did?" "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Withers. "The trunk and the valise came up from Paddington on the early train. I had Harold collect them, brought straight to room 3. But now that you mention it—" "Yes?" "Well, Harold did say the valise felt lighter than expected. But I assumed it was just papers. Solicitors are always carting round a lot of nothing." "And where is the valise now?" "Still in the storage cupboard. No one's come to claim it." Miss Marple followed her to the cupboard. The valise was there, brown leather, scuffed at the corners, the tag still marked S.W. She examined it closely. The brass latch showed signs of tampering. Barely visible scratches, but scratches nonetheless. She opened it slowly. Inside, 2 books of legal notes, a shaving kit, and a half-empty bottle of tonic water. But beneath the false bottom, carefully concealed, was something else. A second envelope, tied with twine. And this one was addressed not to Simon Worsley, but to Margaret Holloway. Miss Marple's heart gave a small inward lurch. She untied the string and unfolded the letter inside. I received your second note. Tilney's estate was not as clean as Eleanor claimed. I've found discrepancies, payments that were hidden, possibly to silence someone. I believe you were that someone. I leave for Milchester next week to meet the innkeeper and confirm records. I am uneasy. If something happens, tell them what you told me. You are not alone. S. Miss Marple exhaled. The tangled skein of motives was beginning to unravel. Worsley had not come to Milchester for rest or inheritance. He had come to meet Margaret Holloway and uncover a buried secret, a financial scandal, tied to Charles Tilney and his niece Eleanor. And now a suitcase had turned up with Eleanor's initials, Simon's scent, and a message meant for a woman who had since disappeared. Later that evening, as the thunder cracked above the inn and the wind began to howl at the shutters, Miss Marple asked Harold, the porter boy, for a quiet word. He arrived sheepishly, still smelling faintly of coal dust and boot polish. You carried Mr. Worsley's luggage from the early train? Yes, ma'am. Did you see who handled it before you? He hesitated. Well, there was a woman on the platform. Blue hat, gloves, she stood near the trunk. I assumed she was just waiting for someone. But when I came back with the porter's cart, the valise had shifted position, almost like it had been picked up and put back down. Did she board the next train? I don't know. She wore a veil, perhaps? Harold blinked. Yes, she did. Now that you mention it. South, the woman in compartment 6. Margaret Holloway, perhaps. Or someone else entirely. Someone who had seen the label, seen the bag, and deliberately swapped it for one of her own. And now the wrong suitcase had turned up, with the right secrets inside. The next morning, Miss Marple visited Tilney House. The manor loomed as always, its ivy-clad walls stained by rain and age, its windows watchful. Eleanor Tilney received her with practiced elegance, a cup of perfectly poured Darjeeling already waiting. I thought we'd seen the last of this business, she said coolly. Regrettably no, Miss Marple said. I'm afraid the matter has deepened. I suppose you've come to accuse me again. Not at all, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I've come to return your cigarette case. Eleanor froze. Miss Marple placed it delicately on the tea table. You left it in your suitcase, the one mistakenly picked up by the porter. The one with Mr. Worsley's tag. Eleanor's voice was calm, but her hand trembled slightly. That's impossible. Miss Marple tilted her head. He gave it to you, didn't he? In Paris. A reunion, perhaps, after your uncle's death? Eleanor said nothing. You were lovers, I imagine, Miss Marple said softly, or something close to it. But he found something that made him doubt you. I never meant to hurt him, Eleanor whispered. But you did, Miss Marple said. Or someone did. And now Margaret Holloway has vanished, and the suitcase meant for her ended up here. You see, Miss Tilney, the truth is very simple. Someone knew what was in that bag, and someone tried very hard to make sure it never reached its intended recipient. Eleanor stood suddenly. I think you should leave. Miss Marple rose. Of course, but before I go, do look in your library. The ledger marked Private Accounts. It's missing 3 pages, torn cleanly. I believe Margaret Holloway was the one who knew what had been erased, and Simon Worsley was the one who planned to expose it. She left the house without waiting for a reply. The rain had stopped, the sky was clearing, but something darker was still brewing. That evening, Constable Fenn arrived again, this time with a sealed envelope. "It was left in the church," he said, wedged behind the altar rail. "Anonymous." Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "The suitcase was never mine, but what I found inside may still kill me. Look to the ledger. M.H." Miss Marple folded it silently. Margaret was alive, but barely ahead of whoever had silenced Simon Worsley. And now all roads led to one final hiding place: Tilney House's library. The secrets were still buried, but not for much longer. Chapter 6. The letter that arrived too late. A single page of handwriting could unravel the entire lie, if only it had come sooner. The post arrived late that morning. Rain had turned to mist, and mist into that low-hanging English gloom that seemed to muffle the village of Milchester into silence. The postman, soaked through despite his mackintosh, looked uneasy as he handed Mrs. Withers the small bundle of envelopes. "One of them's got a London stamp from 3 days ago," he muttered, wiping his nose. "Don't know why it took so long. Nothing wrong with the weather, then." Mrs. Withers, who never liked puzzles that came in brown paper, set it aside on the counter and turned her attention back to the bread order. It was only when Miss Marple entered the lobby half an hour later, coat buttoned to the neck and gloves neat as ever, that the letter revealed its significance. The handwriting on the front was careful, looping, old-fashioned. A woman's hand. Miss Marple knew the type. The envelope was addressed to Miss M. Holloway, CEO, The Old Swan Inn, Milchester. There was no return address. Miss Marple turned it gently in her hands. "Where did this come from?" she asked. Mrs. Withers gave her a nervous glance. "Only just arrived. Odd that. No Holloway staying here, at least not any more." Miss Marple said nothing. She slipped the letter into her handbag and returned to the reading room, where the lamp cast a warm, flickering glow against the drab drizzle outside. She sat, took her letter opener, and slit the envelope. The letter inside was dated 4 days earlier. "Dearest M, I've made inquiries. The missing ledger pages weren't destroyed. They were hidden in the wall safe behind the Tilney House library mantel. You were right. The payments from Charles's estate were redirected months before he died. Simon found the proof. He wanted to confront Eleanor, but he should never have gone alone. I fear he's in danger. If anything happens to him, go to Miss Marple. She will know what to do." No full name, no signature, just the dash, and that final sentence, "She will know what to do." Miss Marple stared at the page for a long while. The fireplace crackled gently behind her. Outside, a dog barked once, then silence. She folded the letter again with infinite care and placed it beside her knitting. The letter had arrived too late to save Simon Worsley, too late to stop Margaret Holloway from vanishing into fear and flight. But it was not too late to catch the one who had made sure the truth never arrived when it should. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid another visit to Constable Fenn, who by now had grown used to her quiet, precise knock. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it twice and scratched his head. "This proves there was collusion between Simon and someone else. Possibly this A. But it doesn't prove murder." "No," said Miss Marple, "but it proves motive. And opportunity." Fenn blinked. "You think Eleanor Tilney killed him?" "I think Eleanor Tilney had something to protect," Miss Marple replied calmly. "And I think she allowed someone else to do the dirtiest part of the work. But the missing ledger pages, their very existence, point to embezzlement, fraud, a fortune quietly siphoned off. Eleanor was set to inherit everything, But Margaret Holloway had a claim, a quiet one perhaps, and one she didn't understand until Simon explained it to her. And now they're both gone. Not gone, Miss Marple said gently. Just scattered. Margaret is still alive. Somewhere. Perhaps even close. Simon, well, we still don't have a body, and I believe that suits someone very well. That evening she dressed for dinner, then walked, rather deliberately, in the direction of Tilney House. The gates stood open, the gravel path wet beneath her boots. The windows glowed faintly. She was not expected, and that was exactly as she wanted it. The butler answered, stiff with discomfort. Miss Tilney is indisposed. I think she'll want to see me, Miss Marple said, in that quiet, iron voice that brooked no refusal. In the drawing room, Eleanor stood near the fireplace, staring into the flames as if she could rewrite time in the coals. She did not turn when Miss Marple entered. You've returned, she said softly, to accuse me again? No, said Miss Marple, setting her handbag down. To give you a chance to tell the truth before someone else does. Eleanor's fingers curled at her side. What truth? The one behind the ledger, Miss Marple said. The payments Charles made to Margaret, the child. The inheritance meant to be split, and wasn't. Simon discovered it. He didn't come to blackmail you. He came to protect someone. And now he's vanished. Eleanor turned, slowly. Her face was pale, beautifully composed. And if he vanished of his own accord, then why swap the suitcase? Miss Marple asked. Why plant the letter behind the altar? Why silence Margaret? She left on her own. Perhaps, but the suitcase she took wasn't hers. It was yours. Eleanor's breath caught. I believe Margaret tried to disappear quietly, but the wrong bag revealed the truth. You weren't just hiding money, Miss Tilney. You were hiding love. That cigarette case in Paris, that wasn't a gift between cousins. Eleanor flinched, as if slapped. He left you, Miss Marple said, more softly now. Or perhaps he simply chose the truth over loyalty. But he meant to bring it all out, and someone couldn't let him. Eleanor stepped back, eyes wide. I never touched him, she whispered. I swear to you. But there was someone else. Someone who followed him here. Who? There was silence, and then a knock at the door. It was Harold, the porter from the inn, pale, wet, trembling. I found something, he stammered. In the garden shed, behind the inn. A coat. They rode back through the rain in Constable Fenn's car. The shed behind the old Swan Inn had not been opened in months, not since before Worsley vanished. Beneath a pile of rags and cracked lanterns, they found the coat. Tweed, expensive, unmistakable. In the inner pocket was a train ticket, crumpled but still legible. Paddington to Milchester. Dated the night of Worsley's arrival. It had been punched, which meant Worsley had boarded, had travelled the whole way, and had disembarked, possibly in the wrong coat, with the wrong bag, into the hands of someone who made sure he never checked in. Miss Marple turned to Harold. You've seen this before. He swallowed hard. I didn't know what it was. I found it weeks ago, after the storm. I thought it was rubbish. Did you show anyone? No. Miss Marple nodded. But someone else knew it was there. The coat was not wet, nor torn. It had not been thrown or buried. It had been placed, as if someone wanted it found, just not yet. Inside the lining was a tear, small, carefully stitched back, and inside it, folded like a secret between stitches, a page, a single page of ledger paper. Miss Marple opened it with gloved hands. 4 names, 4 dates, 4 payments, large sums, transferred from Tilney accounts to private beneficiaries. One name was underlined, Margaret Holloway, the last entry to be paid in full upon formal claim of inheritance. Miss Marple stood very still. The letter had arrived too late to stop a murder, but not too late to prove one had been committed. And now, with Eleanor silent and someone else still pulling strings in the dark, she knew what had to come next. Chapter 7. The name written in dust. In the attic of a crumbling manor, a name long forgotten is written beneath the grime. The rain had returned with a vengeance that night, turning the narrow road to Tilney House into a silver thread of mud and shadows. Miss Marple arrived not by invitation, but by inevitability, her boots damp at the hems, her umbrella folded and slick with the mist of creeping English weather. The manor loomed above her, darkened windows blinking like shuttered eyes. A single lamp glowed in the upstairs corridor. Tilney House was waking again, stirred not by memory, but by fear. Eleanor Tilney did not greet her at the door this time. It was the butler, eyes tired, coat frayed at the cuffs, who led her silently through the gallery where ancestral portraits looked down with bored disdain. They passed the library where the fire had burned low and the mantel still hid the truth, at least until Miss Marple's letter arrived at the chief constable's desk. But tonight she had come not for records or receipts, but for the past itself. "I should like to see the attic," she said quietly. The butler hesitated. "It's not used, madam. Hasn't been in years. Bit of a hazard, truth be told. Warped boards. Rats, maybe." "All the better," Miss Marple said. "The things no one wants seen often end up there." He led her up the servants' staircase, each step a creak in the silence. The house had that peculiar hush of inherited guilt, a quiet you could feel in the walls. The attic door was at the end of a narrow corridor, warped with damp, the brass handle green with time. The butler left her there with a nod and a warning. The key turned reluctantly. The door groaned as it opened. Miss Marple stepped into a low-ceilinged room cloaked in shadows. The air smelled of old fabric, candle smoke, and the faint mineral tang of forgotten trunks. A single circular window, cracked at the rim, let in a shaft of pale moonlight that sliced across the dust. She moved slowly, carefully, brushing aside cobwebs and glancing over ancient boxes, stacked chairs, broken suitcases. Everything had the weight of story, and none of it had been touched in decades. She passed a discarded cradle, a bird cage, a bundle of letters tied with a green ribbon, and then she saw it, on the far wall, beside a leaning wardrobe, where someone had wiped a hand through the thick dust coating the panel, a name etched crudely in a child's scrawl. Holloway. She stood very still. The grime on the wall had settled like sediment. This writing was not recent, and yet the message it bore had returned like a ripple from a thrown stone. She stepped closer and saw beneath the name a small series of scratches, dates faint and jagged. The first was 1923, then 1924, then nothing. It had been a child's hiding place, a place to come when no one wanted her around. Margaret Holloway had lived here, but that wasn't in any of the records. Miss Marple turned and scanned the room again. There, beside the trunk with the broken hinge, lay a doll missing one arm. And inside the trunk, buried beneath layers of yellowing linens and moth-eaten clothes, she found a worn schoolbook. On the inside cover, Margaret H. Tilney, St. Agnes's School, London. Tilney. The pieces clicked into place like a lock reluctantly turning. Margaret had not just been a housemaid, She had not come to Tilney House as an outsider. She had been born into it, illegitimately, secretly, hidden from the world in the attic of a grand house that had no room for unacknowledged blood, and someone had worked very hard to erase her. She stepped out of the attic and down the stairs, careful to keep her face unreadable. Eleanor met her halfway, still in her dressing gown, lips pressed thin. "You've been snooping," she said. "I've been remembering," Miss Marple replied. "Whatever you found," Eleanor said coldly, "means nothing without proof." "But it does mean something," Miss Marple said. "It means your uncle had a daughter. It means the money you inherited was never truly yours. It means Margaret had every reason to come back, and every reason to be afraid." Eleanor said nothing, but her knuckles whitened where they gripped the banister. Miss Marple continued. "The letter arrived too late to save Simon. He came here to help Margaret prove her claim, but the moment he found the records in the ledger, he became inconvenient." "I didn't kill him." "No," Miss Marple said, "but someone close to you did. Perhaps even someone you trusted." Eleanor's voice trembled. "Margaret was a mistake, my uncle's shame." "She was also your cousin," Miss Marple said gently, "and perhaps the only person who ever loved this house without resenting it." Lightning split the sky outside. The room flashed, then went dim again. "She's still alive," Miss Marple said. "You know where she is." "No," Eleanor whispered. I hoped she was far away, gone." "You should have hoped she stayed," Miss Marple said, stepping past her, "because now she's the only one who can tell the truth, and the walls are beginning to listen." That night, Miss Marple returned to the inn with the schoolbook in hand. She dried the pages carefully and placed it beside the folded letter addressed to Margaret. The puzzle was not yet solved, but the shadows were parting, and on a wall in a forgotten attic, the name written in dust had spoken louder than any scream. Chapter 8. The Whisper. Behind the Curtain. An overheard confession in an empty room points to a motive buried in shame. The wind that night had teeth. It howled through the chimneys of the old Swan Inn and rattled the window panes like a drunk demanding to be let in. Outside, the village of Milchester had long since gone to bed, lights snuffed and curtains drawn. Inside, a fire crackled low in the reading room, where Miss Marple sat, knitting untouched on her lap, her eyes on the dark corners of the ceiling as though listening for something no one else could hear. The house had quieted earlier than usual that evening. Mrs. Withers had retired with a headache, Harold had gone off on some errand, and even the usually restless Constable Fenn hadn't stopped by with an update. But Miss Marple sensed the air had changed. The pattern of the mystery she had been unraveling, the deaths, the lies, the vanished woman, the stolen inheritance, was nearing its center. The story had begun on a train, but it would end, she was certain, inside the walls of Tilney House. And walls, she knew, had a way of remembering things long after people forgot. She had not meant to overhear anything that night. It was just after midnight when she rose to fetch her shawl from the sitting room behind the front parlor. A draught from the window had sent a chill through her bones, and she moved with the slow but deliberate steps of someone used to creeping about after the household had settled. The sitting room was dark, save for a sliver of lamplight leaking under the door. She pushed the door gently open, but someone was already inside. She paused just beyond the threshold, shielded by the heavy velvet curtain that hung beside the arch. It was a relic of another century, plush, dusty, and ideal for eavesdropping, though Miss Marple would never have said so aloud. A voice, low, urgent, and unmistakably male, whispered into the hush. "You shouldn't have come back. It was done. We buried it, and you had your share." There was no reply. Silence followed. Then a woman's voice, quiet and brittle as dried leaves. "I didn't come for money. I came because he deserved to be remembered." "You're a fool," the man hissed. "You think any of this changes what you were? What he was to you? You were a mistake from the moment she opened her legs and called you Margaret." Miss Marple's hand went to her chest. "I didn't ask for his name," the woman whispered. "He gave it, in his own way, in the attic, in the ledger. He tried, even if no one else did." The man's voice darkened. "You should have stayed in the shadows, but now you've ruined everything." Footsteps, a creak of boards. Then, "No one saw me come. No one will see me go." Another silence. A door closing gently. Miss Marple remained behind the curtain for several long minutes, heart pounding, with a rare urgency. Then she slipped quietly back to her room, closed the door, and sat in the dim lamplight, replaying every word. Margaret Holloway was alive. She had come back, and someone, likely a man connected to the house, had confessed, not just to knowing her origins, but to helping suppress them. It was not merely greed then, it was shame. The next morning brought with it a sunless grey sky and the faint scent of wood smoke in the damp air. Miss Marple, never one to wait on fate's convenience, requested a private word with Constable Fenn. He met her at the inn, unshaven and irritable. "I overheard something last night," she said. "Something vital." He listened as she recounted the exchange. His face darkened at the more vicious lines, but he waited until she finished before asking, "Do you know who it was?" "I'm quite certain the man was Edmund Lee." "The solicitor from London?" "The same. He visited Eleanor weeks ago, claiming to assist her in arranging Simon Worsley's affairs, but I believe he was involved far earlier, possibly even from the beginning. An accomplice, perhaps, or a cleaner." Fenn frowned. "And the woman?" "Margaret," Miss Marple said softly. "She's hiding, still afraid, but she's watching. She came back to remind someone what they did, and now she's waiting for the rest of it to come to light." Fenn scratched his chin. "If Lee really was behind it, we'll need more than whispers to prove it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then perhaps we ought to go where whispers settle into dust." That afternoon, with Fenn in tow, she returned to Tilney House. The butler seemed startled by their arrival, but did not bar their entry. Eleanor was not at home, he said. She had taken the motor to the station to send a parcel. But Edmund Lee was upstairs, reviewing documents. Miss Marple requested to see him. He stood when she entered, all polished courtesy and tired eyes, the kind of man who wore respectability like a buttonhole flower, meant to charm, but already wilting. "Miss Marple," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Still digging?" She gestured to the fireplace. "May I sit?" He nodded, though a trace of wariness flickered behind his spectacles. "I've always found shame a stronger motive than greed," Miss Marple said quietly. "It corrodes slower, but deeper, especially in families." "I wouldn't know," Lee replied, reaching for his tea. "I never had the luxury of either." She tilted her head. "But you knew Charles Tilney, didn't you? Long before his death." Lee's hand paused mid-reach. "He was a client. You were here during the war, weren't you? When the house was closed, when Eleanor was away at school. You were hired to manage the books. A quiet man, well-spoken, loyal, trusted." Lee said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft as a knife in velvet. "You knew Margaret was his daughter. You helped keep her hidden, possibly even helped send her away. But when Charles died and Simon Worsley began asking questions, you panicked, because Simon found the missing pages, didn't he? Lee's smile was gone now. His eyes had turned to steel. You have no proof? Miss Marple opened her handbag and removed a folded paper. A letter? From Simon to Margaret. He'd found the payments. He suspected they were hush money, and he planned to come here and speak with Charles's heir. But someone got to him first. Lee stood abruptly. You're wasting your time, madam. She rose as well. Am I? Then why did you tell Margaret she was a mistake? Why threaten her last night behind the parlor curtain? His mouth opened, then shut. The color drained from his face. I never... But Fenn stepped in then quietly, as if he'd merely been waiting for the right moment. We'll need you to come with us, Mr. Lee. You've got some explaining to do. Lee didn't resist, but he said nothing. Back at the inn, Miss Marple sat by the fire again. The air outside was still, thick with the promise of more rain. She thought of the whisper behind the curtain, of a voice steeped in bitterness and history. Shame had built Tilney House just as surely as its stone walls had, and it had buried more than just Margaret's name. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Harold entered, hat in hand. This came for you, he said, handing her an envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar. She opened it. Inside was a single page. Thank you for hearing what no one else would listen for. I have nothing to leave behind, but I thought you should see it before anyone else. Taped to the note was a photograph, faded but unmistakable. A young Charles Tilney, with a girl beside him, no older than 7, her face solemn, her eyes identical to his. Miss Marple turned the photo over. Written in careful ink were 4 words. My daughter, Margaret H. She folded the paper slowly and set it in her lap. The house might have forgotten, but the truth never had. And now, so much depended on what Margaret would choose next. If she spoke, Chapter 9 would begin with fire. If she vanished again, the smoke would rise without her. Miss Marple stared into the hearth, the flames crackling low. Some confessions were whispered, others would need to be shouted. Chapter 9, the alibi that died with the dog. The only witness to the murder was a spaniel, and he died the next day. The rain returned on a Sunday, that quiet, persistent drizzle that softened everything. The hedgerows, the headstones, the sound of a man's boots across a gravel path. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the Tilney House gardens, her umbrella tucked neatly beneath one arm, watching as the spaniel's grave was filled in with spadefuls of wet earth. A small cross had been fashioned from birchwood. No inscription, no flowers, just a shallow plot in the orchard, between the old pear tree and the broken sundial. His name had been Jasper, and he had belonged to Eleanor Tilney's late uncle, Captain Charles Tilney, the man whose death had opened the floodgates of deceit, greed, and long-buried family shame. Jasper had been a quiet companion in the great house's last years, a shadow slipping through corridors, a warm presence by the hearth. And now, according to Eleanor, he had passed, peacefully, of age and melancholy. But Miss Marple did not believe that, because Jasper had barked the night Simon Worsley vanished, barked, growled, and scratched frantically at the back door of Tilney House at precisely the time, according to Eleanor, that she and Mr. Edmund Lee had been dining quietly in the study. Constable Fenn, bless him, had mentioned the oddity casually 2 days prior, his notes smudged with damp ink and too many sleepless hours. Funny thing, he'd said. Harold said The dog was howling like mad the night Simon disappeared. Said he woke him, even from down the lane. But Eleanor swore the dog was with her the whole time, asleep by the fire. And now, the dog is dead, Miss Marple had murmured. A coincidence, perhaps, but in Miss Marple's experience, death rarely arrived at the exact moment it was convenient unless someone had sent it an invitation. Back at the inn, she sat by the fire with the letter from Margaret Holloway still folded in her lap. Edmund Lee had been removed from the house under quiet suspicion. Eleanor remained within, claiming illness, sending down brief, polite refusals to all inquiries. The pieces were sliding into view. She had been poring over the old parish registers that morning when she noticed something odd in the burial records. Jasper's death had been noted, though not officially, scribbled in Harold's hand at the corner of a tea-stained page, as if someone had asked him to make the entry discreetly. Jasper Tilney, spaniel, buried 10th October, died 9th, found by stable door. Not in his bed, not near the fire, not even in the orchard, by the stable. Miss Marple folded her notes and rose. Later that afternoon, she stood in the stable yard behind Tilney House, grey clouds hanging low overhead. The stable was barely used now. One carriage horse remained, old and stiff, kept out of nostalgia. But the hay was fresh, and the smell of saddle oil still lingered in the air. She crouched near the door, brushing her gloved hand over the ground. The earth was wet from rain, but beneath the surface she found what she was looking for, a small cluster of pale, waxy fragments. Miss Marple straightened slowly, tucked the evidence into a handkerchief, and returned to the house. Eleanor met her in the sitting room, seated in the same armchair where Simon Worsley had once stood, weeks earlier, with questions about ledgers and a family inheritance gone sour. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said, voice barely rising above the tick of the clock. "If you've come to accuse me of killing my dog, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed." "No," Miss Marple said softly, "only to ask why you had him buried in such a hurry." Eleanor's eyes flicked to the fire. He was old and unwell, and yet not unwell enough to be barking at the stable door the night Mr. Worsley vanished. Eleanor said nothing. "I found bits of sausage outside," Miss Marple continued, "pale, waxy, likely soaked in something bitter. Strychnine, perhaps, easily taken from an old gardener's shed if one knew what to look for." "You have no proof," Eleanor said quietly. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but I do have a very strong memory of you, as a child, tearing up your mother's rose garden because a neighbor's dog barked too loud. You hated disorder, noise, and I believe, witnesses." Eleanor's voice was sharper now. "It was just a dog." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but he knew something. He knew someone had come to the stables that night, and someone wanted that memory gone." Eleanor rose suddenly, pacing to the window. "You think I killed Simon. You think I buried my cousin, and bribed a solicitor, and poisoned my uncle's dog to keep it quiet." "No," Miss Marple said. "I think you covered for someone who did." Eleanor turned, lips trembling. "I never asked for any of this. Margaret should have stayed gone. And Simon, he should have known not to come back." There it was, the crack beneath the paint. "You loved him," Miss Marple said, gently. "Didn't you?" Eleanor sank back into the chair. Her voice was barely a whisper. "He loved her, not me. You let Edmund handle the details. He was always so helpful, so devoted. But loyalty, when mixed with jealousy, becomes very dangerous." A silence settled. Then Eleanor looked up, tears drying on her cheeks. "You'll never find the body." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. So he is dead? But Eleanor said nothing more. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the gardener's shed. She found Harold kneeling in the cold earth, turning compost with practiced ease. "Did you know about the dog?" she asked quietly. Harold looked up, startled. "I heard him barking that night, but I didn't think it was important." "It was," she said gently. "Jasper saw who came to the stables. He tried to stop it, and then he was fed something he shouldn't have been." Harold hesitated. "Miss Tilney told me not to say anything." Miss Marple placed a hand on his shoulder. "And now you've said everything." That evening, a constable returned to the property. A team began searching the orchard again. Not for a dog this time, but for a man. At midnight, they uncovered the stone. Flat, unmarked, embedded beneath the roots of the pear tree. It took hours to lift it, and beneath, they found the shallow grave. Simon Worsley had been there all along, less than 10 feet from the spaniel who'd tried to warn them. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the hole, the lantern in her hand, casting long shadows over the orchard. Eleanor stood beside her, eyes hollow. "He said he'd bury the past," she whispered. "But the past," Miss Marple said, "always knows how to rise." From the dark soil, truth was beginning to breathe. And Chapter 10 would ask one final question. Who else had helped dig? Chapter 10. The trap set at Dandelion Crossing. Miss Marple sends a coded invitation, and the killer walks straight into it. The fog had settled low that morning, thick and spectral, clinging to the bare hedgerows like lace left out in the dew. Dandelion Crossing, little more than a forgotten stretch of country path flanked by tangled thistles and ancient stone walls, lay in a hush that belonged to secrets. The old railway gate, no longer used but still standing, leaned crooked in its hinges as if listening. There was no sign of the wind, yet the tall grass moved anyway, as if rustling with anticipation. Miss Marple arrived alone, dressed in grey wool with a neat velvet ribbon at her collar, her handbag swinging gently from her arm. She looked, as always, entirely harmless. But inside the bag was a letter, not the kind one posts, the kind one leaves behind, and she had left it, tucked into the pages of an unused guest book in the Tilney House library, where she was quite certain it would be found. The message inside was simple, written in an ink that bore a slight smudge, as though it had been written by an unsteady hand. The ledger has been returned. The real pages. Meet me where Charles met her the first time. You'll come if you want to keep it buried. M. She had signed it with a single letter. Not hers, of course, but one that the killer would recognize. A whisper from the past. Margaret's handwriting, copied with uncanny precision. Miss Marple had a gift for mimicry, honed not on stage, but in 1,000 thank-you notes. Dandelion Crossing had once been a lover's spot, before the tracks were pulled up, and the brambles claimed the rails. Charles Tilney and Margaret's mother, whom no one named but everyone had gossiped about, had met there, away from the eyes of the household, a place of trysts, and now a place for justice. Miss Marple stood beneath the birch that still bore the carved initials CT plus EH and waited. Not long. The sound of footsteps came first, measured, heavy. Then a figure emerged from the mist. Edmund Lee. No longer crisp and charming, but drawn, dark around the eyes, coat-collar high. He paused when he saw her, not in surprise, but in calculation. "You," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple calmly. "Not the person you were hoping for, but the one you were always going to meet." His face didn't change. Where's the ledger? Buried. In safer hands than yours. He took a step closer. This is nonsense, Miss Marple. You've no proof of anything. But I have timing, she said softly. And timing, Mr. Lee, is everything. She drew a folded paper from her bag. This is the letter you intercepted. The one Simon Worsley wrote to Margaret. He entrusted it to Harold, who never understood its importance, until I showed him what to look for. Lee narrowed his eyes. You can't possibly think I don't think, Miss Marple interrupted. I know, because I watched you yesterday, when Constable Fenn mentioned the orchard. Your fingers twitched. Just so. Not guilt, perhaps, but fear. Fear that someone had found what you buried there weeks ago. Lee laughed bitterly. And Eleanor? You think she's blameless? No, Miss Marple said. She's guilty of silence, of cowardice, of letting you think she would always look the other way. She did, he said too quickly. She always has. Miss Marple tilted her head. But not this time. She told me about the call you placed, the one from the stable telephone, the one the line had supposedly been down for. He flinched. I had the operator trace it, she said. You contacted a solicitor in London, a man who promised discretion in cleaning up property issues. You were preparing for Simon's return, for Margaret's claim. You weren't just hiding the past. You were preparing to inherit from it. Lee's mouth twitched. I didn't kill him, he said flatly. No, she agreed. Eleanor did, with her silence. But you planned it. You left the gate unlatched. You brought the shovel, and when Jasper barked, you poisoned him too. His face darkened. You can't prove that. But you believe I can, she said, or you wouldn't have come. He lunged then, not at her, but at the paper in her hand. But Miss Marple had anticipated it. She took a step back, just as a second figure emerged from the trees. Constable Fenn, coat flapping, revolver drawn, boots silent on the wet grass. Drop it, Mr. Lee froze. He looked from Miss Marple to Fenn, then back again. It was never about the money, he said finally. It was about respect. He gave everything to that girl. And what did I get? What did I ever get? A reputation you didn't deserve, Miss Marple said quietly. Until now. Lee didn't resist, as Fenn cuffed him. He only muttered once, under his breath. She wasn't even supposed to exist. Back at the inn, the fire burned low and quiet. Eleanor had been taken for questioning. Margaret was still in hiding, but word would reach her soon enough. Miss Marple, tired but not surprised, poured herself a cup of tea and looked at the small black-and-white photograph resting on the side table. It showed a girl no older than 10, eyes wide, hair ribbon askew, standing beside a man who thought no one would ever know. But the past always knew, and tomorrow it would finally be allowed to speak. Chapter 11. The Mourner Who Smiled. Too soon. At the funeral, one face looked too calm, and one hand trembled without grief. Rain had come again, soft but relentless, falling like whispers on the chapel roof. The village of Milchester wore black that morning, umbrellas blooming like ink-stained petals along the cobbled path that led to the churchyard. Simon Worsley's funeral had drawn more faces than Miss Marple expected. Some mourners were curious, others came out of duty or gossip, but a few, just a few, had reason to keep their heads down, their glances short, and their gloved hands from trembling. Miss Marple stood in the third pew, dignified and still, a black hat tilted neatly over her brow. The scent of damp wool and wet stone hung heavy in the air. The bells had not tolled loudly for Simon. His death had no grandeur, no eulogies, only the murmured words of a vicar who had never met him and a congregation that barely knew why he had come in the first place. And yet Miss Marple watched, with sharpened eyes, noting the tension of muscles beneath coats, the subtle leanings of heads toward one another. In her experience, grief often spoke quietly, but guilt had a way of screaming through the body if you knew what to look for. It was during the final hymn, as the mourners lifted their hymnals and sang, "Abide with me," that she noticed the smile. Fleeting, thin, but there. A woman in the last pew, face half obscured by a veil, allowed her mouth to curve, not upward with sorrow, but inward with satisfaction. It was not the smile of someone who had lost. It was the smile of someone who had won. Miss Marple turned slightly, catching a glimpse of her profile. Blonde, perhaps too blonde. Veil black, but the gloves ivory, a striking choice for a funeral. She had not been present at the inquiry, nor among the villagers. She was new, unfamiliar, and just behind her sat a man whose hand, visible just above his coat cuff, trembled ever so slightly, not with sadness, but with suppressed tension. A pulse visible along the wrist, a thumb rubbing across his palm. Not mourning, Miss Marple thought. Anticipation. After the service, the mourners filed out, umbrellas lifted, heads bowed. The casket was lowered beneath grey sky and heavier hearts. Constable Fenn offered Miss Marple a ride back to the inn, but she declined. She had seen something. No, two things, and her mind, that quiet clockwork of memory and logic, had already begun to tick. Instead, she made her way through the graveyard path, boots sinking slightly in the wet earth, until she reached the hedge at the far end, near the old caretaker's shed. She waited, half shadowed by the tree, and watched. The woman in the ivory gloves came last, alone. Her veil now lifted, revealing a smooth, unreadable face. She paused before the grave, looked down, and spoke, barely audible. "He nearly ruined it all, but now we've finished it, haven't we?" Then she turned, walking swiftly, not toward the village, but toward Tilney House. Miss Marple waited a beat, then followed. Back at the inn, she laid her findings before Fenn, whose eyebrows climbed toward his hairline with each passing minute. "But how does she fit in?" he asked. "She wasn't in any of the records. Eleanor never mentioned a cousin or friend." "Not a friend," Miss Marple said. "A client, most likely, or perhaps something closer to a partner. Simon's death benefited many, but someone had to move money, hide it. I believe we've seen the architect." She handed him a photograph taken from the solicitor's office, the group portrait taken at a legal conference 2 years earlier. Edmund Lee stood at the center, and to his left, unmistakably the same ivory-gloved woman, smiled a name tagged simply Vivian Hart. "Vivian Hart," Miss Marple said softly, "investment advisor, known in certain circles for finding creative ways to make unpleasant inheritances disappear." Fenn looked grim. "We can bring her in." "Not yet," Miss Marple said. "We need more. A motive, certainly. But proof? Proof comes only when the guilty believe they are safe." That night, Miss Marple wrote a letter, not a forged one this time, but a real one, addressed to Vivian Hart, signed only with the initials M.H. She asked her to meet in the Tilney House garden shed the next morning. She claimed to have documents, the original will, a second confession. She claimed to want out, and that she had no interest in going to prison for someone else's ambition. At dawn, Miss Marple and Fenn waited in the hedgerow across the garden, breath misting in the cold. Tilney House stood quiet in the mist, and just before 8, Vivian appeared, coat buttoned, gloves pristine. She moved quickly across the lawn, stepping into the shed with the nervous ease of someone used to risk. She didn't know the shed had already been wired for sound, or that Constable Fenn had given the vicar's young nephew strict instructions to wait outside with a notebook. Inside, she spoke in hushed tones. "If you're here, Margaret, I'll make it simple. We both know what was in the ledger. Charles paid you off. You disappeared. Simon came sniffing, and Edmund got stupid. But he's gone now, and I don't fancy letting a dead man ruin what's left." Silence. Then, "I'll pay you. Half. In cash. You say nothing. You disappear again. It's worked once before." She paused, then laughed. Quiet. Ugly. "Grief's easy to fake. You just let your eyes go glassy, and your mouth goes still. It's only the hands that betray you, and Edmund, well, his hands always were a problem, weren't they?" When she emerged, Miss Marple stepped forward from the hedgerow, expression mild. "Grief may be easy to fake," she said, "but confessions are rather harder to ignore." Vivian froze. Constable Fenn stepped up behind her. "Miss Vivian Hart," he said, "you'll need to come with us." That evening, Miss Marple sat once again in the reading room, the fire warm, the rain still whispering at the windows. Eleanor had given a full statement. Margaret, safe now, had returned to the edge of things, seen only from afar, but no longer hunted. Simon's name would soon be cleared. She thought of the funeral, the calm face, the trembling hand. In the end, the body always lies still. It's the living who betray the truth, and in the silence after death, those who smile too soon are always heard loudest. Chapter 12. The Murderer Who Sat Across from Me. The truth stuns them all, but Miss Marple knew it the moment she boarded the train. It had begun, as so many things do, with a journey, not the mystery itself, that had twisted and bloomed in the shadows of Tilney House long before Miss Marple had arrived, but her role in it. Her quiet entrance into the story began, quite simply, on a train. The 5:16 from Paddington, first class, a reserved compartment, and a woman who knew how to watch without being seen. It had been raining then too, the kind of steady, whispering rain that smudged the glass and blurred the world beyond the window. Miss Marple had boarded with her usual quiet efficiency, placed her handbag precisely on the seat beside her, and settled in with her knitting and her thoughts. The compartment was shared. Another passenger, opposite her, smartly dressed, a man of no remarkable appearance, and yet entirely remarkable in what he failed to do. He did not glance up at the newspaper he was pretending to read. He did not sip the tea cooling beside him. And when the conductor came to check tickets, he did not move to retrieve his own. Instead, he shifted the paper just so, blocking his face for a moment. Only a moment, but long enough for Miss Marple to notice the tremor in his hand. A small thing, easily missed, but not missed by her. At the time, she'd said nothing, only tucked the moment away in her memory, as carefully as one stores a pressed flower between pages. Later, when the story began to break, Simon Worsley's disappearance, the missing ledger pages, the lies and betrayals that twisted through the corridors of Tilney House like ivy choking stone, she recalled that moment, that man, that tremor, and the faint scent of cloves and mothballs that lingered after he left the compartment at Reading, not Milchester, as his ticket claimed. Now, many weeks later, she sat once again on a train. But this time, not to depart. This time, to return. To the place where the whole thing had begun. and to the people who still believed the case had been solved. The man arrested, the woman shamed, the inheritance untangled. The truth, they all believed, had been brought to light, but they were wrong. In the drawing room of Tilney House, Miss Marple requested that everyone be gathered. Eleanor Tilney, pale and composed. Margaret Holloway, seated like a ghost, returned to flesh, hands folded neatly in her lap. Vivian Hart, guarded and furious. And at the edge of the room, Harold, the porter boy, who had seen more than anyone knew. Miss Marple stood by the fire, teacup untouched beside her, her eyes gentle, her voice calm. "I thought," she said, "that you might like to know how I truly solved this." No one spoke. "It wasn't the ledger," she said, "or the suitcase, or even the dog. It was the man who sat across from me on the train. You see, Simon Worsley never made it to Milchester. At least not as Simon." A flicker passed across Eleanor's face. The real Simon was already dead before the train left Paddington. Gasps. Margaret reached for the arm of her chair. "But," Fenn started, "the coat, the suitcase." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "Those things were meant to mislead us, to suggest Simon had travelled, had vanished en route. But he never boarded that train." She turned to Vivian. Vivian Hart did, dressed in his coat, hidden by shadows and clever misdirection. She wore gloves, hid her hair, sat still, just long enough to create the illusion. Then slipped off at Reading, where no one noticed a thing. Vivian rose, indignant. "That's absurd." "But you made one mistake," Miss Marple interrupted. "You sat across from someone who sees everything. You carried yourself as a woman, crossed your legs like a woman. The coat disguised your body, but not your posture." Vivian froze. "And the scent," Miss Marple added. "Your perfume. Faint, but there, a clove base. I remembered it again when I passed you at the funeral." Constable Fenn stepped forward slowly. "You're saying Simon was already dead before the train left?" Miss Marple nodded. "Killed the night before. Buried quickly. Vivian posed as him on the train to create the illusion of a disappearance between stations. A perfect vanishing act. All to protect someone." She turned her gaze to the corner of the room. "Isn't that right, Harold?" All eyes swung to the boy. Harold's mouth opened and closed. "You dug the grave," Miss Marple said gently. "Under orders. You thought it was for the dog, but it wasn't." Harold looked at Eleanor, shame written across his face. She said, "It was just until morning. Said he'd threatened her, that he wasn't really dead." Eleanor's voice broke. "I didn't mean he grabbed me. He said he'd ruin us. I pushed him. That's all." Miss Marple's voice did not rise. And Vivian came to help clean up. And Harold, scared, loyal Harold, did what he was told. Vivian's shoulders slumped. It was only supposed to be a bluff, to scare him off. Then he fell. She panicked. We had to make it look like he vanished, like he never made it here. The room was silent. "Why tell us now?" Margaret whispered. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "Because the truth, when buried, never truly dies. It waits, just like you did." Constable Fenn moved to arrest Vivian. Eleanor would be questioned further. Harold, his role minor but necessary, would likely be spared. But it was over. Later, as the train pulled out of Milchester Station, Miss Marple settled once again into her seat, knitting in her lap, the countryside rolling past. The rain had stopped. The truth had found its way home. And the murderer, who once sat across from her, was behind bars,